bots, and a regulation around them seems to me like a sensible application, at the moment at least. I'm surprised there isn't any rules around bots.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for taking your time this morning. It's our first session of the Global Digital Future Think Tank, which is a video series to engage people again in the discussion that we're having on the podcast, to involve different members of the different people to this conversation, whether it's master students and PhD researchers and also young professionals in the field. So really, really excited. In this first session, we have Priyank Mathur, who is the CEO of Mythos Labs. They create content and engage in entertainment for counter narratives online. And we have Tanvi Kanchan, who works in communications at IT for Change. We have Ryder, a PhD doctoral researcher at SOAS. We spoke to him previously about deepfakes on the podcast. And we have our junior producers from the Global Digital Futures. That's Eliza and Deirbhile Bhranain, both SOAS MA students. So let's get stuck in. We're talking about extreme speech and content moderation online in response to our latest podcast with Dr. Mapondera. So I'm just going to start by posing a question to the floor. What instances or phenomenon are you seeing in your regions or in the projects that you're working in around extreme speech and online hate speech and the sort of issues that has caused? So maybe I can start with you, Craig. We've recently spoken about this. You're focusing on Sri Lanka. What have you sort of
Sure. So there's unfortunately always many cases in Sri Lanka, and there's a new case this week of 2 individuals who have been crucified for spreading false information online. That's the headline. There's not much other information about it, and I'd quite like to have come to the meeting with more. And I've contacted a few journalists on the ground there, but no one's presenting the facts at the moment on Twitter. So I think that's because they probably don't know the full details. But yeah, that's obviously a horrific case, and I can't imagine what side or what provoked that. But famously, one I can speak a bit more about is the case from 2018, when there was riots around Kandy and Ampara, 2 fairly big cities, anti-Muslim riots, and they were motivated by a coerced video of a Muslim restaurant owner confessing to poisoning the stock of his restaurant for the Sinhala patrons. And the video coercion was spread on WhatsApp and Facebook, and as a result, it generated a whole spate of anti-Muslim violence that continued around the country. And in response, the government shut down WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram, basically all social media platforms for 7 days. And that was when I was working as a journalist there. So that was quite a strange time, I have to say, to have a first-hand experience of a shutdown. I hadn't had that, to my knowledge, at least before. And effectively, we couldn't work. No one could report on anything. Probably more importantly, no one could communicate with their peers, their loved ones, or run their businesses. The internet came back suddenly after 7 days, and in the last few years, when there's been other cases of anti-Muslim violence, or after the Easter Sunday bombings, which was in 2019, the government hasn't pulled the plug on the internet, and instead has now introduced a fake news law, and they can arrest people for spreading fake information. And again, that's equally draconian and worrying.
Problematic. Yeah, I mean, you've touched on a couple of things there. Specifically, well, one thing who sort of decides what is problematic speech online, because, you know, either it could be, sure, inciting violence or targeting oppressed groups, etc. But it also could be a form of censorship, which is really dangerous, right? And well, by the government, for example. And I think that we're seeing this sort of push and pull a lot in India. Maybe Tanvi, you could speak about, you know, some of the measures and instances that you're seeing in your work.
Sure, yeah, thanks so much, Chipo. I just wanted to kind of start by talking a little bit about hate speech and specifically gender-based hate speech, which is an area that we at IT for Change work a lot on and that I'm involved in as well. And I think one of the things, of course, that we've noticed over the last year or so, and particularly with the lockdowns and the pandemic, has been this kind of increase in gender-based hate speech online on social media platforms. And Mythos Lab, in fact, has a great report on this as well, where they kind of track the increase in searches for misogynistic content on social media platforms, and how that really just saw a large uptick in about May, June, July of last year, when we were in the really in the core of our lockdowns in India and other parts of South Asia. And I think this is quite kind of symptomatic of the fact that there has been this pushback against women and people of non-normative genders and their kind of increase in digital literacy, or specifically them laying claim to online publics to be more visible members of society, because it is a public sphere arena after all. That is what social media platforms kind of do. And having these kinds of lockdowns and this kind of extended period of being inside the house, and therefore having maybe more of an influence of, say, your family members or the people that you live with, kind of controlling the ways in which you access digital spheres. We're seeing that in real time, how that's affecting the kind of content and hateful content that we see on social media platforms as well. And this is, I mean, a large concern. It is because essentially what ends up happening is it leads to self-censorship. IT for Change has a 2019 report called Born Digital, Born Free, where we talk to women in southern Indian states, and we kind of survey about over 800 women, where we talk to them about the kind of gender-based hate that they've been exposed to online, or their experiences basically the online sphere. And we see that 3/4 of the people that we've surveyed have experienced some form of gender-based hate speech or violence online. And essentially what ends up happening is that it leads to self-censorship, it leads to this kind of chilling effect. And you see that women kind of withdraw from the online sphere. They don't feel as comfortable laying claim, because what you're met with is this kind of violent pushback of hateful content. And I have a few thoughts about where we can go in terms of then how do we address this problem. But to specifically answer your question about kind of the measures that are being imposed in different parts of the world to deal with this, I think, of course, a lot of us know about the intermediary rules that's come into play in India, and kind of the different reactions to it. And I think, for me, I think it's always a question about power, and it's always a question about power differentials. And if we're specifically thinking about what kind of speech is hateful speech or is speech that should be prohibited, we're looking at questions of power there. So we're looking at, is it essentially targeting marginalized groups or individuals? Is it reifying these kinds of power structures that we already see outside online spaces? And you just kind of see a reproduction of that online. And I think one of the interesting things with the intermediary rules, I won't go into too much detail about specifically what the rules are about, but I think an interesting development has been that the UN Special Rapporteurs on the freedom of expression, the right to privacy, and the freedom of peaceful assembly have actually made this communication to the Indian government, where they've kind of laid out certain concerns about the intermediary rules, and laid out concerns that these kind of overbroad definitions of what is violating content can lead to a suppression of dissent. And I think that's an interesting submission, and an important submission that's coming from the UN Special Rapporteurs. And it is something that kind of also then addresses this tension between how do we protect the interests of marginalized groups and marginalized people, and make sure that they're not on the receiving end of really hateful content when they lay claim to these online publics, whilst also making sure that we're not having a kind of seesaw into the other direction where it's used to then suppress dissent, it's used to then kind of make sure that people cannot use the democratic space of social media platforms to kind of engage in critiques of what's happening. And I think that's, I think specifically one of the things that's interesting as well in the submission that the special rapporteurs make is that they kind of urge the Indian government to open up the rules to a wider consultation with different stakeholders, and kind of urge them to take their views into account as well, and then develop something that narrowly enough targets, the interests of targets hate speech, which is human rights violations, whilst not also then suppressing dissent. So I think these are some kind of interesting, I've touched upon a few different things, but these are some interesting strands. Yeah.
Amazing. And you did touch upon a few different things. You've sort of sparked a question about, the different measures that are being used. And India has its measures, but I'm sort of quite interested also in when Western measures are or solutions are then brought into global South local context, right? There's not really a one size fits all. And you mentioned having different stakeholders involved to really monitor and probably address different concerns within these processes. Priyank, I noticed on your website, in terms of some of the research projects that you've done, some CVE guidebooks, some research that you did in Kosovo regarding CVE as well. Could you just speak about these sort of like processes to addressing solutions? Who are the stakeholders involved? How have Mythos Labs been involved in these?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks, Tanvi, for the shout out to our report about online misogyny. I'm glad Craig and Tanvi have already touched on much of the hate speech in this part of the world, but my 2 cents on that really quick, just because I had to say, when you said what kind of extreme speech are you seeing, maybe it's because I'm a man and I don't personally see this as much, so it's more of a shock to me, but I was blown away by the kind of online misogyny we saw when we started tracking that. I mean, we've made videos where people are quoting the Quran, and we don't get a single negative comment. But we made one video in India where we talked about the gender pay gap. I mean, it was one line in the video mentioned the gender pay gap. And we got like 15 comments accusing us of being feminazis and, just all sorts of, the ugliness of sexist hate speech, I think, is not appreciated enough. Like, we don't, Facebook doesn't even have a separate category for misogyny as a form of hate speech, which blows my mind. It's highly overdue. So sorry for the indulgence. I just had to put that out there. But to your point about the Western interventions, yeah, I mean, we've done, as you mentioned, in Kosovo, so we do a lot of research, we do content creation, and we do a lot of capacity building. And I have to say, I mean, what I really like about this initiative that you guys are doing at Global Digital Futures is you're forcing people like me and all of us to think about these issues that are traditionally approached from a Western perspective, from a Global South perspective, which even I, as somebody who's, not of Western ethnicity and somebody who spent much of my time in the Global South, even I, because the power structure, to go back to Tanvi's point, even in the solutions community is still set up where the West is the leader. I mean, we get our funding. The richest organizations in this space, the richest donors, are Western donors, and they have certain ways of doing things. And it's not always driven by a malicious attitude, or it's not always, it's just, there's, they are trying to put their resources towards solving a problem. So their first instinct is to try and do what they've seen work at home, or how they would approach this if these problems were in their backyard. And in Kosovo, it's an interesting example. Kosovo is just it's an awesome place. I used to be a comedy writer at The Onion, and Kosovo, to me, like, there should be a TV show about the Kosovo society, because it's this cute country that just hasn't been a country for that long. And so they're so honest in their, like, in talking about the problems they're experiencing, which older, more proud countries might be too ashamed to sort of admit they're struggling with. But Kosovo's they're like, listen, we were protected by the UN until 2004 or 8, I think. And then suddenly now we're sort of, as a result of geopolitics way bigger than us, we're now told, hey, manage this. So it's if anybody's, we've got SOAS students online and stuff, all of us, I assume, are interested in international development. Kosovo is just an amazing petri dish of how countries form and the struggles they go through. And one point on the Western interventions, I started thinking about this yesterday when Chipo was kind enough to invite me to this. If I really, I hadn't really thought about this much before, but one of the issues I think we encounter in development, led by wealthy organizations from the West, is that we have this idea that things need to be proven in Western research literature. Once they get that seal of approval, then we can apply them elsewhere. And there's, I think, a tacit bias against non-Western literature. So I think we've all experienced in some ways, that when you mention Oxford published this or Princeton published this, it gets a different reaction in the room than, the University of Bombay published this paper. And as we all know, dealing with academia and research, the quality of research is as good as the people who wrote it. It's really as simple as that. So I think one thing it would be great to see more of, and maybe as places like GDF start to emerge more and more and occupy more of the space and more of the conversation, we can start to see a little bit of that, the closed-mindedness broaden just a little bit. That, there is good research coming out of universities in countries you may never have visited or heard of. And in many ways, that research is something we should be paying even more attention to. And the irony of all ironies is I work a lot in the, I used to work in counterterrorism as an intelligence officer at the US Department of Homeland Security, about as Western as it gets. We would parade around the world telling other countries how they ought to be fighting terrorism. And we would never think twice about the, how that might come off or how that would make people feel. It was just this assumption that, well, we're the American government, we know what we're doing. And the irony is now there's a huge need for CVE, countering violent extremism, in the United States. And I almost feel like asking, and it would come off as a cheeky question, but I don't mean it to be, but like, are we now going to welcome Indonesian experts and, Jamaican experts and Tanzanian experts to America to sit across the table from people who are used to having a lot of power and a lot of sway and saying, here's what you're doing wrong, here's how you got into this mess, this is why it's your fault, and we've got the solutions? I don't think the American policy establishment would react well to that at all. And yet that's what we've been doing. I mean, so we need a lot of introspection, either we being organizations associated with the West that go around, and I think many times with a sincere desire to help. I'm not saying it's insincere, but we just need to introspect about that.
Yeah, I mean, you've touched on so much there, especially sort of, I think the personal interests or the business interests or of whoever is trying to intervene. I think we've seen in the Global South with platforms like Facebook where their business interests were not as big for them. They didn't take much responsibility, or didn't feel like they had to take much responsibility in the outcomes that occurred as a result of communications on their platforms. We've seen that in Myanmar, for example. Ethiopia is another example. I think now as the mainstream conversation shifts to the Global South needs these platforms, open up the internet as a space for democracy, there is really now more questioning of what are the roles and the responsibilities of those platforms, who should be accountable. I'd like to sort of throw that question to the floor and get your views on that. Eliza, go ahead, thank you.
Yeah, no, it's interesting properly holding the tech companies to account, because Priyank, I saw you on the UNESCO talk the other day about extreme speech, and I was surprised that the conclusions from that were so much about digital literacy, which is obviously hugely important. But I was a bit disappointed that there wasn't and more about the architecture of social media and holding to account surveillance capitalist logic, which doesn't operate in the interests of people finding a space for democratic consultation or whatever. And yeah, it's interesting that it tends to sway away from that. And so often that discussion, that sway is supported by these tech companies that want to talk about the content moderation that they're doing, rather than the fact that ultimately they exist to extract more behavioral data.
Yeah, sorry, if I could just, that's a great point, Eliza. And it's one of the pities about the Zoom things. There's no sort of after the panel, just casual talking in the hallway. But I do remember being on a panel with a Facebook gentleman from a couple of years ago, right before the pandemic. And after the panel, somebody presented him with a very similar question saying, but the business model seems to be inherently designed to divide people and cause some of these problems. And he said something that I thought was kind of insightful off the record. He said, well, we treat that as a totally separate part of the business. So those of us on the policy side come from places like SOAS and from the UN, and we have that mindset. And he said that, he said that, I've brought this up behind closed doors, but I'm told stay in your lane. That's not a policy issue. And that seems like a cognitive dissonance going on at Facebook, that they need to come to terms with the fact that it's one and the same.
So Craig, you mentioned internet shutdowns in one of the in a case that happened in Sri Lanka, and it's really interesting to me. I think it's really important to also speak about the different strategies of frustrating online communications. Platform control is one thing, let's say by governments or maybe even by tech companies filtering content, because that's still quite questionable, because do they have the right to decide what is democratic and where in the world, but you have, platform moderated internet shutdowns, as you mentioned, internet throttling, creating lags in the infrastructure, in the internet infrastructure. China is a good example with its, firewall, offline intimidation. These are all sort of things that are influencing and impacting sort of online communication. Can you speak a little bit more about that? And, just questions around that, issues around that.
Sure. I think what I'd like to say is that, and it's probably building on Eliza's point actually, is that we or society needs to look at or understand platforms and social media to be not a homogenous entity. So whatever the rules apply for Facebook are very different to what should apply to other social media platforms. And the reason I say this is because I did a bit of research last year where I tested I did a discourse analysis over Reddit, which I really enjoy, and Facebook, which I really despise, about the conversation of 5G and the conspiracy theory around 5G causing coronavirus. And what I found was that on Facebook, where people have to have their real name, apparently according to Facebook's policy, was that people were really, surprisingly, really rude, quite violent, and there was lots of infighting, even on Facebook groups that were seemingly on the same side of the debate, that 5G was causing the coronavirus. Whereas on Reddit, where everyone is anonymous, you have to be anonymous, and you don't have you don't have a profile picture, is that the debate was just really curious, and it was actually really supportive of people trying to find genuine information. And this idea is contrary to actually a lot of what researchers suggested about Reddit in the past, which apparently is, the toxic manosphere. It's full of geek culture. I think Reddit in itself has had a bit of a rebrand during the Black Lives Matter movement. The CEO of Reddit stepped down and promoted a black leader into the position. It's a profound moment. And I just feel that, so when a country like Sri Lanka has an internet shutdown and bans all social media platforms, it's in a reaction to Facebook, but it's also curtailing the other platforms that might have better or more open conversation happening. And that's a real concern. So I wanted to mention Reddit because I think it's on any topic, you can probably find real, genuine, brilliant nerds talking it out, and you'll have such a richer understanding of any debate. And equally, if you go to Facebook and do something silly, you'll come out with a very xenophobic or just general disgust a bad taste in your mouth, I think.
Well, I guess that goes to perhaps the need for counter narratives on different platforms, right? Or or maybe what you're saying is even spaces for counter narratives, like Reddit versus all of some more popular platforms, you know. And counter narratives, I think, well, in my knowledge anyway, when I was studying 3 years ago, this was one of the solutions more talked about in response to hate speech and extreme speech online. You know, the platform's accountability wasn't even a discussion, actually. So I was really interested to discover your organization, Priyank, and your sort of focus on counter narratives and creating you know, content around that. So yeah, just would you speak a little bit more about how counter narratives fit into the different solutions that
Sure.
or responses to CVE now?
Sure thing. They're definitely, as you mentioned, an important part, not a holistic solution on their own. So you still need the media literacy and the research. But what we tried to do is we also got into the counter narrative space about 4 or 5 years ago. And at that time, there were counter narratives being made, but I think one of the inspirations for why we felt we could contribute something unique here was that a lot of the counter narratives were being made by large funders who were investing lots of money in high production quality, but then had no plan for making sure this is content that the target audience actually A, wants to watch, and B, will ever see, like it'll ever reach them. You'd see the biggest donors in the world spend $30,000 on a video and then host it on their YouTube channel, which has 40 followers. And it made no sense to us. So we said, let's make the content more entertaining. And one way, I'll admit with my background, I was biased towards comedy, but there is a lot of research to suggest that comedy is uniquely effective when you're talking about sensitive issues. There's a quote I really like by Oscar Wilde. He said, if you want to tell people the truth, make them laugh. Otherwise, they'll kill you. And I think that's really true in our world. And so we partnered with comedians, and it so happened that 3-4 years ago, and it was the same in Nigeria, in India, and Indonesia, in a lot of the places where there was a lot of development money pouring in, there was this content boom happening like 5 years ago. It started with YouTube and Facebook, and just, you had creators. I mean, when I was growing up in India in the 90s, there were no comedians. There was no such thing as stand-up comedy. But now the country is bustling with them because of YouTube, because of smartphones. And so we took advantage of that. It was this kind of perfect storm. And it was like, you've got all these great creators who are good at getting the attention of local young people, which is who the NGOs and the donors want to reach. So, you know, instead of making, I mean, I remember looking at a State Department counter narrative video, and it was, you know, my friend who worked there really proudly showed it off to me. And it was on the official YouTube channel of the State Department. First of all, I don't know how many budding terrorists subscribe to the YouTube channel of the State Department. But second, it was literally just a guy from Texas with his army fatigues, first like adjusting the webcam, like, is this thing on? And then just be like, hey son, don't become a terrorist now. And it was like, you know, you were reading articles about ISIS putting out, like, they had taken the movie American Sniper and photoshopped in their own person's face instead of Bradley Cooper, re-released it on Twitter, calling it ISIS Sniper, got hundreds of thousands of views. And you know, the question that bothered me was, if you're a kid in Pakistan and Turkey and India who's maybe being bullied at school, maybe going down that radicalization path, you've got the choice to watch this cool American Sniper type action movie or that guy bumbling with the webcam. Obviously, you're going to choose the American Sniper movie. So we wanted to create content that could compete with what ISIS was doing, that could compete with what the best propagandists in the world were doing. We thought entertainment was the way to get young people. We thought hosting these videos on the channels of the social influencers, of the comedians who made them, would be much more effective. We thought taking out the branding and saying brought to you by State Department and all that, even the UN, which has a much higher favorability, I'd say, globally than the US government, even they, though, you know, you kind of reach that bias of, oh, okay, you switch off. You're like, this is a PSA. I don't need to really, pay attention to this. So that's kind of been our approach to counter narratives. But I do think that people are starting to realize that a lot of the tech companies' eagerness 3 years ago to push us all towards, hey, counter narratives is the solution, counter narratives, counter narratives, counter narratives, that may have been hiding. And you know what, Chipo, I think they're going to keep doing this. It's counter narratives today. Now it's media literacy, right? So that's going to be the new thing for the next 3 years. Media literacy, and you'll have Facebook and YouTube championing the way. Eventually, they're just going to have to face the music. Maybe it's our business model, maybe it's you, bro. Like, I think somebody needs to make a T-shirt or something and give it to Mark Zuckerberg, because I don't know how else they're going to get it.
Great, amazing. So Tanvi, I just wanted to ask you, like, what are some of the solutions or responses to this issue of CVE that maybe your organization is working on, or that you're seeing even in India or in the region?
Yeah, thanks so much, Chipo. And I just want to say, I just wanted to kind of echo Priyank's point about, counter narratives and even counter speech, has its role, and it has a space to the extent where it's maybe effective, or maybe something that you can engage in, or enable communities to engage in. But at some point, we really need to take a good hard look at the business model of these social media platforms and say that, well, if you're profiting off of virality and you're profiting off of, how much content is shared or how much people are engaging with it, of course, polarized content is going to be the ones that your algorithm is going to push. And of course, that's essentially directly contributing to your profit. So 100%, on that point, I think that's really important to keep in mind. And yeah, I think in terms of countering gender-based hate speech or hate speech online, and there are a few different things that my organization is working on, but also a few different strands I think that we need to think about. And one of the things is I very firmly believe that we really need to have some kind of global benchmarking exercise where we kind of set down the norms of what constitutes hate speech. And that needs to happen at the multilateral level, because, you look at things where, and I think it's something we discussed as well, where, states on their own will kind of have their own very varying definitions of what constitutes problematic speech or what constitutes, illegal content. And there needs to be a kind of benchmarking exercise that is grounded in human rights, that's grounded specifically in protecting the human rights of users and communities, and making sure that people's right to claim space in the public sphere isn't being kind of pushed back against and not enabled because of the kind of hate that they see online. An interesting research that we actually conducted over the part of last year, last few months of last year at IT for Change, was a participatory action research that we did with a group of youth from Karnataka, from Karnataka and Bangalore is where IT for Change is based, where we basically were doing this participatory action research against gender-based hate speech online on social media platforms, but in Kannada, which is a local language in India. And I think this is, this also kind of goes back to this question and the discussion that we were having earlier about these Western norms that are just kind of copy pasted into different contexts in the global South, which don't really apply, because we're also facing the question of how do you moderate content or hateful content in local languages. And we don't really have a system. The social media platforms don't have an answer for this right now. We're looking at things mostly in English. And, this is a tangent, but one of the things that we have seen in India and other parts of South Asia as well is that what users will frequently do is write hateful messages in a local language, but using the English script, or they find ways to circumvent the algorithm so that it's not picked up by, the AI content moderation procedures as content that violates the community standards or the content moderation standards of that particular platform. So you have users kind of doing these things. And of course, whether it's, an algorithm or whether then you have human moderators, they don't have the context to understand whether something is hateful in a particular nation or a particular context, because minorities differ from context to context, power differentials differ from context to context, and you need to be attentive to that. You need to understand, for example, in India, what is caste-based hate speech and what is casteist hate speech, because that's such a big problem that we see as well. And when we talk about gender-based hate speech, a lot of it that's directed towards, for example, Dalit activists, Dalit women activists, is also casteist. So, you have that happening there as well. But, kind of going back to the participatory action research that I was talking about, the youth were kind of involved in investigating attitudes towards sexist hate speech online in their own communities. And they also try to engage in counter-speech methods and counter-speech activities. And it was interesting to hear their feedback after the entire process, because, counter-speech that's undertaken by people from marginalized social locations, it's a big amount of emotional labor. And it kind of, doesn't also, it's not attentive to the fact that you're putting yourself in a vulnerable position if you're engaging in counter speech whilst being identifiably of, a marginal social location, because what essentially will very oftentimes ends up happening is you're exposing yourself to more hate and you're exposing yourself to more pushback. And, we don't know if there's really any impact on what it's actually setting out to do, which is, there's this idea that if you kind of have positive speech out there, it kind of, it'll just kind of, it'll negate the hateful speech that's on the platform, but that's not really what happens. And I think that there really needs to be some kind of framework for setting down the responsibilities of social media platforms in a way that's specifically grounded in ideas of rights and justice, specifically grounded in protecting marginalized people and marginalized communities. And it's attentive to, how we can make sure that people's ability to lay claim to the digital sphere isn't being impacted by this. So I think that's really, an important move that we need in my eyes. And that's something that can only originate to some level on the multilateral level. And of course, there are, other considerations there about the efficacy of multilateral rules and regulations. And those are other questions. But I think that's an important starting point. Like, we need to have at least some kind of definition of gender-based hate speech on the multilateral level for us to even move forward, if we're talking about gender-based hate speech specifically, but also hate speech in general. So I think these are kind of some of the areas that I'm thinking about and where I'm at when it comes to this topic.
Yeah, it's so complex because there is no one solution. It's almost like quite a few things need to be happening in tandem, also need to be tested and iteratively responded to based on like responses and reactions and efficacy, I suppose, which is very hard to measure in cases like these. Craig, in your research, are there any sort of your research, you're looking at deepfakes, are there any sort of like responses to deepfakes or some sort of solutions? Well, I don't know, I'm wary to say solutions to deepfakes, but yeah.
I'm not sure at the moment in terms of deepfakes, but in terms of talking about synthetic content, I think it's important to point out the role of bots in hate speech around the world and disinformation. And as Tanvi, correctly just pointed out, there's so much cultural complexity to content moderation, give it local vernaculars, local cultures, normative understandings of what constitutes hate speech. But if there was a rule that could identify a rule or a law, and I'm not someone who necessarily prescribes to laws and rules, but if bots were removed from Twitter, then the amplification of hate speech and disinformation would be curtailed somewhat, because when there's a great researcher called Philip Howard at Oxford University, he does lots of research around bots, and he found, I know it's in a Western context, but in 2016 Trump election, a ratio of 1 to 1 tweets during the election was a bot amplifying disinformation. I presume that sort of statistic probably, or I suspect that statistic exists in elections and political contexts all over the world. I think Twitter have a real, and other social media platforms have a real, uphill mountain to climb when it comes to dealing with hate speech, but bots and a regulation around them seems to me like a sensible application, at the moment at least. I'm surprised there isn't any rules around bots. I mean, anyone, there's a guide on the internet. It doesn't take long. You can make a bot to, say hateful things. It's a bizarre place, the internet.
It's a bizarre place, the internet, for sure. I think we'll actually start to wrap it up now. Just want to make it, 45-minute conversation. So if you have any sort of, closing remarks or thoughts that you'd like to share before we close.
I can go first. Thanks. This is really a lovely discussion. I learned so much and I was taking notes. I think that one of the things I've learned from the discussion is that we need the global definition of hate speech is not only something we need, as Tanvi mentioned, but we need to keep iterating as well. And the things like the bot legislation, which I actually absolutely agree with Craig, that is just one example of why we need the tech companies on board. So I think that I would love to see in 2021 and beyond, we start to change the conversation. So we force the tech companies to include their business model as part of any discussion related to hate speech and extremism, because we can't have a real discussion until we're at least allowed to talk about that.
Great, yeah. I think it's a conversation that continues to be ongoing. Hopefully, I mean, like, it was so interesting in Matthew's interview, how he was speaking about the shift from this democratic view of the internet and social media platforms to this more nefarious and evil side. So hopefully we can sort of start to see a change in that, swing that around by more, I don't know, integrated solutions. And I think, these conversations about what's happening in the global south, which organizations, which researchers, which players are working on, these issues in the global south is really important to really have that, global solution, which I think has been lacking. But yeah, really, really, really interesting. So thank you so much for your time, everyone. If nobody else has anything that they'd like to add before we close.
I just wanted to add a point, Chipo, just to echo what you were saying as well about kind of having these insights and research and viewpoints emerging from the global south and having more discussions like this and more spaces like this, where we kind of really are decentering this Silicon Valley perspective to, how is a social media platform designed? How does it operate? What are the ways in which it's moderated? Because obviously we can see that that's not a framework, and that's not a model that's working for the rest of the world, and particularly for the global south. And I think just kind of amplifying marginalized voices from the global south, and specifically the ways in which they're experiencing social media platforms, is such an important thing and such an important point from where we base off of different discussions. So I'm really glad for a space like this where we can kind of talk about these different approaches and the different contextual realities. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.